What Boris Johnson's Greek hero teaches us about epidemics.
鲍里斯·约翰逊的希腊英雄教给我们有关流行病的知识11到10次。
Minutes Boris Johnson at the Parthenon and image copyright.
图像版权
Getty Images.
盖蒂图片社
Image caption.
图片说明
Boris Johnson at the Parthenon in May 2012, shortly before the London Olympics 2012.
年5月伦敦奥运会前夕，鲍里斯·约翰逊在帕台农神庙
Presentational white space as Boris Johnson recovers from COVID-19. He will undoubtedly be thinking of an earlier epidemic, says Oxford classicist Armand Dangour, the plague that hit Athens in 430 BC and killed the prime minister's hero, Pericles. It's an episode, Dangour argues, that holds many lessons for today.
牛津古典主义学者
Armand D. Dangour
说，当
Boris Johnson
从新型冠状病毒肺炎中康复时，他无疑会想到一种更早的流行病，公元前430年袭击雅典并杀死首相的英雄
Pericles
的瘟疫。这是一个插曲。
D. Dangour
认为，这为今天提供了很多教训。
Britain's Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is well versed in the history and culture of ancient Greece. He knows that Western literature begins with a plague, the epidemic described in the opening book of Homer's Iliad, of which Boris can happily declaim scores of verses from memory. And his political hero has long been the ancient Athenian leader, Pericles, whose bust sits in his office in 10 Downing Street.
英国首相鲍里斯·约翰逊精通古希腊的历史和文化，他知道西方文学始于一场瘟疫。这场瘟疫在荷马的《伊利亚特》的开篇中有描述。鲍里斯可以从记忆中高兴地朗诵大量的诗句。他的政治英雄一直是古代雅典领袖伯里克利。他的半身像放在他位于唐宁街10号的办公室里。
The Prime Minister has often quoted admiringly the stirring oration given by Pericles to honor the dead after the first year of a destructive war against Sparta. And he will be well aware that Pericles gave a second famous speech a year later, after a devastating plague, probably a form of typhus, had killed around 1/3 of Athens' citizens.
首相经常钦佩地引用伯里克利在对斯巴达进行破坏性战争的第1年后向死者致敬时发表的激动人心的演说。1年后，在一场毁灭性的瘟疫，可能是一种疱疹伤寒，夺去了雅典1/3公民的生命之后，伯里克利发表了第2次著名的演讲。
Pericles, giving one of his orations image copyright.
图像版权
Getty Images.
盖蒂图片社
Image caption.
图片说明
Pericles, giving one of his orations.
伯里克利给他的演说之一。
Both orations were reported by the contemporary historian Thucydides, whose searing description of the Great Plague is worth reading for its literary virtuosity alone. Commentators today have drawn parallels between the responses of Athenians, ranging from the heroic to the contemptible, and those of valiant NHS staff and scared panic buyers today.
当代历史学家修昔底德
Thucydides
报道了这2篇演说。修昔底德对大瘟疫
Great Plague
的犀利描述值得一读，仅仅是因为他的文学鉴赏力。今天的评论家们把雅典人的反应从英勇的到可比的与英勇的
NHS
工作人员和恐慌的买家进行了比较。
But surprisingly, none has drawn attention to the lesson Thucydides himself intended. What doesn't change, wrote the historian, is human nature. You can expect people to react in similar ways when they encounter events like those that have occurred in the past. He embarked on his work, he says, because a clear grasp of the events he was living through could guide responses to similar events in future.
但令人惊讶的是，没有人注意到修昔底德本人的意图。这位历史学家写道，人类的本性是不会改变的。当人们遇到类似过去发生的事件时， 你可以期待他们会有类似的反应。他说，他之所以开始工作，是因为对自己所经历的事件有一个清晰的了解，可以指导人们对未来类似事件的反应。
Bust of Pericles image copyright.
图像版权
Getty Images.
盖蒂图片社
Image caption.
图片说明
A bust of Pericles.
伯里克利的半身像
He modeled his method on that of the most innovative medical practitioner of the day, the physician Hippocrates. Rather than prescribing prayers and religious rituals, spells and incantations, or exotic herbs and quack remedies, Hippocrates and his contemporaries were visiting sick patients, meticulously noting their symptoms, and keeping track of how they responded to prescribed treatments such as sleep, exercise, and the regulation of diet. Boris Johnson was a patient at St. Thomas Hospital, and is likely to have been participating in a medical trial that compares treatments for COVID-19, so it may be that Hippocrates will come to his mind, as well as Pericles and Thucydides.
他模仿当时最具创新精神的医生希波克拉底的方法。希波克拉底和他的同辈们并没有开出祈祷和宗教仪式、咒语和咒语，或者异国草药和庸医的处方，而是去看望病人，一丝不苟地记录他们的症状，并记录他们对诸如睡眠、锻炼和饮食调节等规定治疗的反应。鲍里斯·约翰逊是圣托马斯医院的一名病人，他很可能参与了一项医学试验，比较新型冠状病毒肺炎的治疗方法，所以希波克拉底可能会出现在他的脑海里，就像伯里克利和修昔底德一样。
One of the worst aspects of the plague was the despair into which people fell on finding they had the disease. Those who were convinced they had no hope were much quicker to give up and die, observed Thucydides. Another was the rate of infection among those who flocked to care for and doctor to others. They died in droves, and had the highest incidence of mortality. In addition, the plague led to greater crime, since criminals calculated on escaping detection and penalties.
这场瘟疫最糟糕的一个方面是，人们发现自己患有这种疾病时陷入绝望。那些确信自己没有希望的人更容易放弃，然后死去。修昔底德说，另一个原因是那些成群结队的去照顾他人和给他人看病的人的感染率，他们成群结队的死去，死亡率最高。此外，瘟疫导致了更大的犯罪率，因为罪犯们计划逃脱侦查和惩罚。
Boris Johnson making a speech in Latin in 2007, as part of a campaign to ensure the continued teaching of classics in schools. Image copyright.
图像版权
Getty Images.
盖蒂图片社
Image caption.
图片说明
Boris Johnson making a speech in Latin in 2007, as part of a campaign to ensure the continued teaching of classics in schools.
鲍里斯·约翰逊在2007年用拉丁语发表演讲，作为确保学校继续教授古典文学运动的一部分。
What might we learn from these observations? First, that people should avoid becoming infected by close contact, and that medical staff and carers should be protected. Secondly, that the law must continue to function robustly. And thirdly, that it is important for people to preserve a positive state of mind. Measures to achieve these aims have been, if in some cases belatedly, widely pursued in the UK and elsewhere.
我们可以从这些观察中学到什么？第一，人们应该避免被密切接触而感染，应该保护医务人员和护理人员。其次，法律必须继续有力地发挥作用。第三，人们保持积极的心态是很重要的。为实现这些目标而采取的措施，尽管在某些情况下有些姗姗来迟，但在英国和其他地方得到了广泛实施。
The Athenians survived the plague of 430 BC with astonishing resilience. Just 15 years later they were able to muster a huge military and naval force to mount an offensive expedition overseas. But when the plague struck, Athens had only recently gone to war, and a large contingent of troops had been sent north to pursue hostilities. Sadly, they took the disease with them, and over 1,000 men died from it.
雅典人以惊人的韧性，在公元前430年的瘟疫中幸存下来。仅仅15年之后，他们就能够集结一支庞大的军事和海军力量，向海外发动进攻性远征。但是当瘟疫来袭时，雅典刚刚开战，一支庞大的特遣队被派往北方进行敌对行动。不幸的是，他们带走了这种疾病，1000多人死于这种疾病。
Socrates image copyright.
图像版权。
Getty Images.
盖蒂图片社。
Image caption.
图片说明。
Socrates did not conform to the Athenian ideal of beauty.
苏格拉底并不符合雅典人对美的理想。
One of the soldiers serving on the campaign was the philosopher, Socrates. Not only did he survive infection, allegedly thanks to his physical toughness and discipline, but on return to his plague-ridden city he was said to have tended unscathed to the sick and dying. Socrates had evidently acquired immunity from his earlier exposure to the disease, just as Thucydides himself, who had survived infection, recognized that this made him immune from reinfection.
参加竞选的士兵之一是哲学家苏格拉底。他不仅幸免于感染，据说这要归功于他强健的体魄和严格的纪律，而且回到他那充满瘟疫的城市后，据说他照顾病人和垂死的人，毫发无损。苏格拉底显然在早期接触这种疾病的过程中获得了免疫力，就像修昔底德本人在感染中幸存下来一样。他意识到这使他免于再次感染。
It was to be thousands of years before medical immunity was properly understood, but the historian implies that historical hindsight can itself be a kind of vaccine. History need not simply recall the horrors of the past. It can guide us towards adopting precautions, remind us that accurate observation is vital to ensure a better response in future, and reassure us that normal life will one day return.
要过几千年才能正确理解医学免疫性，但这位历史学家暗示，历史的后见之明本身就是一种疫苗。历史不需要简单的回忆过去的恐怖。它可以指导我们采取预防措施，提醒我们准确的观察对于确保未来做出更好的反应至关重要，并使我们放心，正常的生活总有一天会恢复。
Meanwhile, we should also remember that history never repeats itself exactly, even if it can offer valuable lessons for posterity.
与此同时，我们也应该记住，历史从来不会完全重演，即使它可以为后代提供宝贵的教训。
The Acropolis scene at sunset image copyright.
图像版权。
Getty Images.
盖蒂图片社。
Image caption.
图片说明。
The Parthenon was built during the age of Pericles.
帕台农神庙建于伯里克利时代。
Pericles had been the leading citizen in Athens for over 3 decades before his death from the plague at the age of 66. Until that day his luck had held to a remarkable degree. He had been admired and bitterly reviled, had fought military campaigns and faced legal trials, and had survived accusations of corruption and sexual misconduct. In his 50s he entered into a passionate and enduring relationship with the brilliant young Aspasia of Miletus, who bore him a child and helped him compose his magnificent funeral oration to the war dead.
在66岁死于瘟疫之前的30多年里，伯里克利一直是雅典的领导人物。在那天之前，他的运气一直很好。他曾受到钦佩和严厉的斥责，参加过军事运动，面临过法律审判，并且从腐败和不正当性行为的指控中挺了过来。 在他50多岁的时候，他与才华横溢的年轻的米利都阿斯帕西亚建立了一段充满激情和持久的关系，后者为他生了一个孩子，并帮助他为战争死难者谱写了华丽的葬礼演说。
Britain's Prime Minister is 55. He has faced stern challenges, has experienced failure as well and success, and has benefited greatly from luck, no less than political skill. When, as is hoped, he makes a full recovery from COVID-19, perhaps busts of the historian Thucydides, the physician Hippocrates, and the philosopher Socrates should join that of Pericles on his mantelpiece in number 10 Downing Street.
英国首相现年55岁，他曾面临严峻的挑战，也经历过失败和成功，并从运气中获利匪浅，不亚于政治技巧。正如人们所希望的那样，当他从新型冠状病毒肺炎完全康复的时候，也许历史学家修昔底德、医生希波克拉底和哲学家苏格拉底的半身像应该和唐宁街10号壁炉台上摆放的伯里克利的半身像一起。
Professor Armand Dangour, the author of Socrates in Love, The Making of a Philosopher, wrote the Greek ode that Boris Johnson recited at the opening gala of the London Olympics in 2012.
在世界中心呼唤爱，哲学家的诞生一书的作者
Armand D. Dangour
教授，在2012年伦敦奥运会开幕式上，为
Boris Johnson
写了一首希腊颂歌。